This is BBC One in the northeastern Cumbria, and now the 10 o'clock news with Hugh Edwards and Richard Thomas.
There'll be a decision this week on giving special help to the Americans in Iraq. Some British troops could be moved to more dangerous areas under American command. Ministers spell out the consequences if they said no.
We will have failed in our duty as an ally and as a country that has closely supported the United States.
We'll have a special report from Ben Brown, who's with the British troops in Basra. Also tonight, English schools face the biggest single reform of exams in a generation. Passive smoking, the dangers are now said to be even more evident. And a celebration at home for Britain's heroes of the Olympic Games.
And here in up north, there's doubts about the future of the £470 million MOX plant in Sellafield before it's done anything. And the ballot papers are on their way. The debate over a regional assembly enters its final stage.
Good evening. Britain will have failed in its duty as an ally if it turns down the American request for special help in Iraq. So said Geoff Hoon, the Defence Secretary, who promised a formal decision this week. British troops are now preparing to be sent to areas of Iraq under US control. Earlier today, Mr Hoon faced claims from some Labour MPs that the American request was political and related to the presidential campaign. First tonight, this report from our political editor, Andrew Marr.
Fallujah, centre of the insurgency for months now, an effective capital of anti-Western Iraq, a town the Americans have decided needs to be subdued at last. To do that, they say they'll need British help, not here, but to cover for them, well north of Basra, where UK forces are now. It's help they're almost certain to get.
The UK reconnaissance team will deploy to the area tomorrow to provide further information, which will inform the Chiefs of Staff. I expect the final recommendation from the Chief of the Defence Staff by the middle of the week.
The implication was that no decision had yet been taken, and officially perhaps it hadn't. But emotionally, it already has been. Here's what Mr Hoon said when he was challenged by a Liberal Democrat MP.
If we refuse the Americans' request, what penalties are we likely to incur?
There will be no penalty, but we will have failed in our duty as an ally and as a country that has closely supported the United States.
And one rumour that's been rampant on the backbenches was that British deployment is politically inspired, designed somehow to help President Bush in the final stages of the US election.
I want to make clear that the request is a military request, and although it is linked to elections.
This is BBC One in the northeastern Cumbria, and now the 10 o'clock news with Hugh Edwards and Richard Thomas.
There'll be a decision this week on giving special help to the Americans in Iraq. Some British troops could be moved to more dangerous areas under American command. Ministers spell out the consequences if they said no.
We will have failed in our duty as an ally and as a country that has closely supported the United States.
We'll have a special report from Ben Brown, who's with the British troops in Basra. Also tonight, English schools face the biggest single reform of exams in a generation. Passive smoking, the dangers are now said to be even more evident. And a celebration at home for Britain's heroes of the Olympic Games.
And here in up north, there's doubts about the future of the £470 million MOX plant in Sellafield before it's done anything. And the ballot papers are on their way. The debate over a regional assembly enters its final stage.
Good evening. Britain will have failed in its duty as an ally if it turns down the American request for special help in Iraq. So said Geoff Hoon, the Defence Secretary, who promised a formal decision this week. British troops are now preparing to be sent to areas of Iraq under US control. Earlier today, Mr Hoon faced claims from some Labour MPs that the American request was political and related to the presidential campaign. First tonight, this report from our political editor, Andrew Marr.
Fallujah, centre of the insurgency for months now, an effective capital of anti-Western Iraq, a town the Americans have decided needs to be subdued at last. To do that, they say they'll need British help, not here, but to cover for them, well north of Basra, where UK forces are now. It's help they're almost certain to get.
The UK reconnaissance team will deploy to the area tomorrow to provide further information, which will inform the Chiefs of Staff. I expect the final recommendation from the Chief of the Defence Staff by the middle of the week.
The implication was that no decision had yet been taken, and officially perhaps it hadn't. But emotionally, it already has been. Here's what Mr Hoon said when he was challenged by a Liberal Democrat MP.
If we refuse the Americans' request, what penalties are we likely to incur?
There will be no penalty, but we will have failed in our duty as an ally and as a country that has closely supported the United States.
And one rumour that's been rampant on the backbenches was that British deployment is politically inspired, designed somehow to help President Bush in the final stages of the US election.
I want to make clear that the request is a military request. And although it is linked to elections, it is not linked to the US elections, but with efforts to create the best possible security situation in which to hold the Iraqi elections in January.
The Tory front bench cautiously backed the decision, but not the manner of its making.
The Secretary of State needs to understand that the families of those who will have watched with disbelief the unfolding shambles of the last few days and the uncertainty and inability of the government to make clear and prompt decisions on such vital matters.
And on the Labour benches, almost no enthusiasm at all.
What the British people really want to see is a clearly defined exit strategy from Iraq and not greater commitment and greater danger for our troops out there.
United Kingdom's given 110% on this issue, and some of us have provided political cover and support for this government. I beg him not to try and stretch the envelope too much, otherwise it might burst.
The mood in the Commons wasn't mutinous, it was more suspicious. If MPs felt that this was one final deployment, that Iraq would be made peaceful and the troops would then come home, they'd be comfortable with that. But no one here knows that, and many of them are very uneasy. Andrew Marr, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, British military commanders in Iraq are now considering America's request. If they approve it, soldiers from the Black Watch could be deployed within days. The government has rejected suggestions that any troop movement north towards Baghdad could leave gaps in the south around Basra. Our special correspondent, Ben Brown, is the only television journalist with the British troops there.
Since the war last year, this part of Iraq, down in the south, has been relatively peaceful. Certainly, British troops have taken far fewer casualties than their American counterparts. But now hundreds of British soldiers are preparing to head north into terrain which is much more dangerous and more hostile.
I expect the final recommendation from the Chief of the Defence Staff by the middle of the week.
In the mess hall here, we found troops hanging on every word of the Defence Secretary's statement today, as it was relayed to them from London. These soldiers know the new deployment, if it happens, will be a big change in Britain's military commitment to Iraq. This afternoon, we joined troops on patrol around Basra. Theirs is a softly sort of soldiering. They play football with the kids. And they hand out greetings cards. It's all very different from the American Army's more aggressive, some would say more macho style. Often the British troops don't even wear helmets.
We tend to give out water and sweets and things like that, the sort of things that we learnt in Northern Ireland. And we tend to give out things like pens and pencils and things to the kids other than the sweets. But the water always goes down well, and the pens, pencils, that sort of thing always goes down a treat as well.
But will all of this be a luxury if and when the British end up patrolling closer to Baghdad? Will they have to toughen up their rules of engagement to bring them into line with the Americans? Just some of the questions running through the minds of soldiers here. The Black Watch battle group are the troops on standby to go and help out the Americans. They fought to capture Basra in the war last year, and since then they've seen action against Shia rebels in the south. It is these Shia fighters, loyal to the radical cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, who still pose a threat to the British Army. Indeed, some commanders fear that without the Black Watch, British forces here could become undermanned and overstretched. Getting 600 or 700 troops to their new positions north of here is a major logistical exercise. They've been planning it for several days already. Now what they're waiting for is the final go-ahead from their commanders and from the politicians in London. Ben Brown, BBC News, with the British Army in Basra.
We can talk to Andrew Marr at Westminster and to Justin Webb, who's in Washington. Start with you, Andrew. We had a flavour of Labour opinion in your report there. How concerned are ministers about the likely response whenever they announce this decision?
I don't think there will be an immediate revolt of any kind, Hugh, but I do think that the politics are going to get more difficult. There's been a sense up to now that somehow the British troops were behind a kind of dotted line in Iraq, and a lot of the worst of the fighting and the worst of the casualties were being taken further north. The Americans have taken a heck of a pasting up there, and they have been involved in some much more dangerous activity. So it's not entirely just about the way they operate, it's also where they've been operating. Now, one thing is clear, that assuming this decision is taken this week, and we all think it will be, that dotted line is then crossed. It may be the right thing to do, it may be the wrong thing to do, but it makes Iraq more volatile, and it makes it politically more difficult still.
Well, let's cross to you, Justin. If that decision is made, if the troops are deployed in this way, how will that play, do you think, in what remains of the campaign there?
It plays well for the White House for two reasons. Number one, if it were to allow the administration and the Iraqi authorities to retake Fallujah, then that could plainly be portrayed by the administration as progress in the war on terrorism. And if it were done with few American casualties, because there were more American troops there, then that also would be plainly a very good thing. But secondly, and I think much more important, it's this dotted line that Andy Marr was talking about. John Kerry, the Democratic challenger, is going around the country telling people America has 90% of the troops in Iraq, is bearing 90% of the casualties. He's even talking about the possibility that the Bush administration, if it were to be re-elected, would have to reintroduce conscription, the military draft. If British troops took on a role in which they were involved in heavier fighting, if they were more visible to Americans, then that for the White House would count for a lot in the discussions about Iraq, the debate about Iraq in the week or so up to the election. So none of this, a yes is not going to result in the re-election of George Bush, but it's not going to do him any harm.
Justin and Andrew, thank you both very much. And by the way, Newsnight will be talking to the Defence Secretary, Jeff Hoon. That's over on BBC Two after the news. English schools are facing the biggest single reform of examinations in a generation. Teenagers would study for a diploma, which would bring England into line with many of the systems favoured elsewhere in Europe. Plans have been put forward by the former Chief Inspector of Schools, Mike Tomlinson, who said the reform was meant to guarantee minimum standards while also stretching the brightest pupils. He proposes the introduction of a new four-level diploma, which would include elements of the current A-level and GCSE exams, but would also require assessment of core skills in English and maths to address some concerns about poor literacy and numeracy.
Today's 11-year-olds could be amongst the last to experience the current exam system.
Would you times 6 by 4 by 3?
These proposals mean the end of A-levels and GCSEs as separate freestanding qualifications, although they'll survive as key components of a diploma scheme which goes much wider, requiring everyone to pass tests in maths and English and allowing job-related specialisms. The man proposing the changes wants a new approach to secondary education.
I want to change the attitude that says that vocational education is for other people's children and not mine. But, of course, always saying vocational is important. So we've got to change that attitude. We won't change it by preaching to people. We must change it by showing that the offer that we make young people in vocational education is a high-quality offer and is valued by employers.
When you're doing your spreadsheet...
For the advanced diploma, students could choose traditional subjects or vocational courses in, for example, business, engineering, tourism or agriculture. Here they welcome bringing academic and job-related studies into a unified system.
This country's never managed to get a clear attitude towards vocational and academic and bring them together in a way that meets individual children. You've got to meet the needs of all children, not just a section.
There'll be extra, tougher questions in the advanced diploma to help universities identify the exceptionally bright. Coursework in every subject will be replaced by a single extended project, and many exams will be replaced by assessment by teachers in their own schools.
That's got its disadvantages and advantages because, you know, from one side teachers may be biased and they'll use, things against you. From the other side, it will be good because teachers do know you better than examiners do.
It does take the pressure off you in terms of having to sit lots of exams at the end. So if you can spread it out across the year, it could be, a lot of students might find that easier for them.
The Prime Minister has welcomed the proposals but sought to reassure supporters of A-levels when he spoke to employers tonight.
The purpose of the reform will be to improve upon the existing system, not to replace it. GCSEs and A-levels will stay, so will externally marked exams, and reform is designed to strengthen the existing system where it is inadequate.
But the Tory leader appeared to smash hopes of a consensus by saying he'd returned to the A-level system 20 years ago when only a fixed quota could receive top grades.
There are some things in the report we agree with, but what we are setting out today is a Conservative action plan to restore faith in the exam system and to reinforce A-levels as the gold standard in that system.
Announcements like today's can receive an awful lot of hype, but in this case it does seem to be justified. These could be the biggest changes to upper secondary education for over 50 years. But there are two tests. Will it do enough to stretch the most able students while at the same time stripping vocational education of its second-class status? Mike Baker, BBC News, Essex.
Inhaling smoke from other people's cigarettes is a substantial public health hazard, according to a report by some of Britain's top medical scientists. The Scientific Committee on Tobacco and Health completed its review 4 months ago and concluded that no child or adult should be exposed to passive smoking. But the report has yet to be published. The government has denied ignoring or suppressing the survey, as Anita McVeigh now reports.
Lighting up in public places is still a matter of choice in the UK, although there's increasing pressure to change the law. Today's report underlines the potential hazards of second-hand smoke. In a London pub tonight, the non-smokers had mixed views on the debate.
It's a risk that you take when you go drinking, and I think that one goes with the other.
I don't particularly like smoking in any public place at all. I just have to put up with it.
The Scientific Committee on Tobacco and Health says passive smoking increases the risk of lung cancer by 24%. There's a 25% increase in the risk of heart disease, and it says children are particularly vulnerable.
One of them is a smoker, and one of them is a non-smoker.
Cancer specialist Dr. Xiaoming Li says up to 10% of new lung cancer cases each year are in non-smokers. He believes passive smoking is a major factor in these.
It's a lethal disease, and I feel if passive smoking or public smoking were to be banned by the government, there will be a significant health benefit to the country.
Ministers have denied holding back the report, which the pro-smoking lobby says is inconclusive. But the government is coming under pressure to follow the lead of Ireland, which introduced a total ban on smoking in public places.
We need to look more at the predominance of those who are non-smokers and to move the policy in that sort of direction.
The government says any step it takes on smoking must balance the rights and responsibilities of individuals. It appears reluctant to follow the Irish example, but a limited ban could run the risk of satisfying no one. Anita McVeigh, BBC News, West London.
And still to come on tonight's programme. Split from top to bottom, all eyes on the swing states 2 weeks before America's polling day. And out of Italy, the greatest of Raphael's works on show in Britain. President Bush and his Democratic challenger John Kerry are spending much of their campaign time in Florida today, the state that decided the election for Mr. Bush 4 years ago in highly controversial circumstances. This time, Florida is one of 10 states where the candidates seem to be neck and neck. Both men have made strong appeals to all their supporters to get out and vote. All their calculations are based on the 538 votes of the Electoral College. That's the national mechanism for electing the president. For every state a candidate wins, he adds to his tally in that college. All eyes are now on the so-called swing states, where the margin between Bush and Kerry is impossibly narrow. One of those states is Colorado, where Matt Fry found deep divisions between the supporters of both candidates.
Colorado, a state split right down the middle, in a nation divided by politics more than ever before. And it starts here, in a place the other side calls the People's Republic of Boulder.
Are most of your friends Democrats?
Yeah, my best friend hates Bush.
And that's just Mitch, still too young to vote. Breakfast at the Krems, the bagels are plain, but the conversation is damning.
I'm scared to death.
Why? Well, you're just where the Republicans want you to be then.
Because I'm really afraid George Bush might get reelected.
Fear and loathing is what's driving the Krems to the polls. Next stop, downtown Boulder and a Democratic rally. The star attraction is none other than Robert Redford. Like the Krems, also on the hustings for the first time. If Bush gets re-elected on the 2nd of November, how will you feel?
I'll probably be in London. Oh, no, probably Ireland. I mean,
visiting or living?
Living.
Hello. Hey.
Snarf's the boys' favorite deli. Susan is a volunteer health worker. Steve made his money in the dot-com boom. Over lunch, they let rip on Bush and Iraq.
It's insane. And so much of the American public believes and has been led to believe that it's retribution for 9/11. That it is sick. Do you have any Republican friends?
Well, our next door neighbor Jody is a Republican, but especially this election year, stuff gets heated so fast.
To appreciate how wide the gulf is between these two warring factions, the Republicans and the Democrats, we're heading south to Colorado Springs, 100 miles door to door, but a world apart. Pikes Peak, one of America's great mountains, overlooking one of its fastest growing cities and one of its most Republican. It was here, by the way, that George Bush met God. Today, we're meeting the Broemans, up early doing their bit for the vote.
The passion, the enthusiasm that is behind President Bush is just incredible. And I think passion makes people do incredible things, whereas a lot of John Kerry's supporters are anybody but Bush.
His beliefs and his faith in God just make him a great man, and just when he speaks, it warms my heart.
No help from Hollywood here, but then the Republicans believe they have God. Like John Kerry, the Broemans and their 4 girls are Catholic. Unlike John Kerry, they believe abortion is a sin. Over lunch at the Ritz Grill, we heard all the other reasons to stick with Bush. For you personally, what's at stake in these elections coming up?
I think the safety and security of the world. I think President Bush just knows what he needs to do to knock out the war on terror that not only affects the United States, but affects your country as well.
The same sky over 2 Americas on the eve of an election where winner takes all. Not exactly a recipe for healing wounds. Matt Fry, BBC News, Colorado.
Many of Britain's medal winners in the Olympic and Paralympic Games have been cheered on by thousands of people in central London. Nearly 100 athletes took part in the parade, after which they attended a reception at Buckingham Palace. Adam Parsons has the story.
It had been styled as the Parade of the Heroes, and certainly there were plenty of star names winding their way through London today, here to mark Britain's best Olympic Games for 80 years and to soak up some adulation.
It's amazing, absolutely amazing. I could never have imagined sort of the response that I got personally, but for the whole team I think it's been amazing for everyone to come out and support us.
Olympians rarely get this sort of attention, but then again, they don't often win as many medals as they did in Athens. For some, those games have been a very fast track to fame.
Oh yeah, it's been brilliant, yeah, it's been just hectic. My life's just changed so much. I've been going, doing a lot of appearances, a lot of TV shows, a lot of programmes, and I've never been home, but I'm enjoying it and taking it all in my stride, and it's good.
Khan's family were watching on proudly. The crowd here wasn't as huge as the one that greeted England's rugby team last year, but this was still an impressive homecoming that ended in a packed and exuberant Trafalgar Square. And tonight, a trip to the palace, a chance for the Queen to meet her rising stars. This was a day designed to applaud British sport and to bolster London's campaign to stage the 2012 Olympics. It seems to have done both. Adam Parsons, BBC News.
Do the people of the northeast of England want an elected regional assembly? We'll soon find out, because 2 million voters have now been sent ballot papers for a postal referendum. If they vote yes, the Assembly would be created with powers over the region's economic development. But opponents complain it would be an expensive talking shop. Mark Mardell has been to the region to assess the arguments there.
The Tyne positively gleams with the new investment that's gone into Newcastle recently, but some say the whole huge region would do much better with its own government, just like the Scots, the Welsh and Londoners. They say it'll only cost a couple of pounds extra on council tax a year.
Providing this is successful and providing it assists the North East in speaking with one voice and competing better as a North East region, then whatever the cost will be, it will be worth it. Because let's face it, they're suggesting it'll be about £24 million in the first year, and council taxes will be added to by about 5 pence per week on a Band D property. And it may be actually higher than that as time goes on. But it's very difficult to put a cost on what we could get out of all of this.
Outside Durham Cathedral, no campaigners manhandle their inflatable verdict on the Assembly, which would probably be based in the city. A costly burden, they say.
The proposals in this bill, which is what the people of the North East are being asked to vote on, really do provide jobs for the boys, not jobs for the North. You know, there's 2 pages on political salaries, allowances and pensions. There's 2 pages on the funding of political parties and special advisors. There's half a page, 5 paragraphs on highways.
The Assembly would cover an area from Darlington right up to the Scottish border and have 25 elected members. It would cost between £25 to £30 million a year to run and have powers over housing, public health and the fire brigades. But many of the powers aren't set in stone. This isn't a battle over the fine print, but 2 warring instincts, a desire for a strong regional voice versus a distrust of politicians and bureaucrats. When the North East's 2 million voters go to the polls, it won't be only their own future they're deciding. If they vote no, then it's likely the whole idea of English regional government will be killed off, much to the government's embarrassment. Mark Mardell, BBC News, Newcastle.
One of the greatest Renaissance artists, Raphael, is to be the subject of a major new exhibition opening this week at the National Gallery in London. It's the first time so many of his works have been brought together outside Italy, as Razia Iqbal explains.
This picturesque Umbrian town, Città da Castello, can claim to have played an important part in the creative life of the Renaissance master, Raphael. The empty space in this gallery usually displays one of the earliest commissioned paintings he ever did, aged around 17. And now it's in the National Gallery, the first time in 500 years it's left the place where it was painted. The processional banner is one of the highlights of this show.
Apart from the lure of works never seen outside Italy before, this exhibition presents Raphael's story for both the expert and the layman. It traces his precocious talent and his fame as a master. It also reveals his reputation as a lover of women.
There's no doubt that Raphael was a great religious painter, but it was his humanity and tenderness often revealed in his Madonna paintings which stood out. Pride of place here is the tiny Madonna of the Pinks, controversially acquired by the National Gallery for £22 million. Raphael was definitely a ladies' man.
He was said to have died from an excess of lovemaking. He dies at 37, and all through his life there are hints that the ladies definitely loved him. However, it has to be said that on the whole, love didn't distract him from his main purpose, and it's amazing how many works we have by him.
And as more than 80 Raphaels are shown in London, there's much excitement in another small town in Umbria. Italian restorers in Gubbio think they have uncovered another early Raphael masterpiece. The painting being revealed here on television for the first time is a processional banner, much like the one now in London. It's not been included in this major exhibition, however its discovery is likely to cause much discussion and disagreement, a sign that 5 centuries on, anything to do with Raphael creates a stir. Razia Iqbal, BBC News.
We'll be back a little later with the latest on the headlines. Now it's time to join our news teams across the UK. Bye for now.
Good evening. British Nuclear Fuel says it's optimistic about the future of its controversial MOX plant at Sellafield in Cumbria, despite claims today that the government is discussing ways of closing it. The plant cost £470 million to build and has yet to fulfil any of its contracts. The National Audit Office says it's likely the government will consider the future of the MOX plant from April next year. BNFL admits it has had problems, but the company says it's still confident it can deliver a top-quality product to customers in the future. A Darlington GP who secretly filmed intimate examinations of female patients has had his jail sentence increased by the appeal court in London. Describing Dr. Saeed Hussein's conduct as a grave breach of conduct, the court increased his sentence by a year from 3.5 years to 4.5. Lord Justice Rose said the original sentence was unduly lenient and said the aggravating feature was the adverse impact which Hussein's actions had had upon his victims. Hussein of Lazenby Grove in Darlington was jailed at Leeds Crown Court in May. Voting papers on the plans for a regional assembly for the North East started going out today. They should be dropping onto doormats this week. It's now less than 3 weeks before voters give their verdict